This is the Secular Nation Podcast, an official production of the Atheist Alliance of America, bringing you breaking news and stories about the intersection of the atheist free thought movement and government action. Hey everybody, this is Secular Nation. I am your host, Justin Clark. I'm here with my co-host, Jeremy Casey. How's it going, sir?
It is going good. How's it going with you?
Not too bad. It's been a very, very busy few weeks. We have not had a show, I think, in almost 2.5 weeks or 3 weeks because of a lot of big changes that are going on within the Atheist Alliance of America. We're doing a big organizational change. Some people have left. Aaron Ra, our president of Atheist Alliance of America, has resigned, and he is going on to pursue politics. He is trying to win the Democratic primary for Texas State Senate District 2. This is the first time a Democrat has run in that district since 2002. So the last challenger of the Republican, and I either think the 2016 or 2012 election was a Democrat, was a Libertarian. So it's good to see that Aaron is going to be pursuing that. And then we've also had Rob Penzek, who is our executive director, has also left, and I have become the new executive director of Atheist Alliance of America. So my hope is to come into the organization and to kind of rebuild and to kind of get us through this transitional period and come back better than ever. So that's kind of what's been going on with Atheist Alliance of America. You can still sign up as a member at atheistallianceamerica.org. We'll still be trying to do this show every week. And we look forward to finding a new president. So we're looking at some really good candidates right now. And for our listeners, if you think of a person within the atheist movement or secular movement who you think would be a good fit for the Atheist Alliance of America in terms of being president, shoot us an email. You can email me at justin.clark@atheistallianceamerica.org. And then, Jeremy, what's your email?
secularjak@gmail.com right now, but I'd like one of those atheistallianceofamerica.com emails at some point.
We'll get you one of those soon enough. We'll get you one of those. I'll make sure to put that up in the business at the next board meeting. So that's what's been going on with Atheist Alliance of America, and we are really looking forward to having a new president and to be doing a lot of really cool content for all of you. And speaking of content, let's get on with the show. This week's topic is, I think, a really interesting one. And Jeremy proposed this idea of talking about Cold War religion, talking about what happened to Christianity, particularly evangelicalism, after World War II, and its impact on American politics. So if you look at the 2016 election, Donald Trump won evangelicals by 81%. This was a higher percentage that Mitt Romney got. It was actually a higher percentage that John McCain got. So why did evangelicals love Trump? That's really kind of the question we have tonight. And I think we've got some really interesting articles to kind of highlight why this is the case. Before we get into the first piece we're going to talk about, which is that sermon that you found, Jeremy. Okay. And I'll let you kind of take the reins on that particular thing. But one I do want to talk about is, this actually was a great topic in relation to my thesis research. As many of you may have known from me talking on my other podcast or on here, I wrote a master's thesis on Robert Ingersoll, the freethinker, and he had a sort of public intellectual dialogue, if you will, within the press and within pamphlets with an evangelical preacher named Dwight Moody. And in the 1890s, Dwight Moody wrote one of his most popular sermons. It was called Sowing and Reaping. And what this sermon that he wrote kind of made light of is that it kind of goes with that classic quote, you reap what you sow. And so this is in some ways hearkening to the beginnings of what would become the prosperity gospel. And so Moody's by no means the first person to talk about this. We're going to talk about another preacher here in a minute who also kind of talked about this same thing, and I think did it way more explicitly than Moody did. But Moody made this argument that a man reaps what he sows. And if you sow good works, if you do good in your life, then you will reap what you will get good returns. And that's not just in like being a good person or donating to your church or being philanthropic or charitable. That's also included in capitalistic matters. Dwight Moody, before he was an evangelical preacher, was a shoe salesman. And so he never really had that much of a problem with capitalism and didn't have that much problem with sort of market economies. And so what he did have a problem with was sort of what he thought was sort of the rampant godlessness that was sort of a part of what was going on because of sort of rapid industrialization and this sort of hybridizing of American culture with immigration in the late 19th century. But Moody really did believe that if a man does well in this life, if you sow well in this life, meaning you are a good person, but more importantly that you have a good business or you do well financially, that's not necessarily a bad thing because you're sowing what you're reaping. And that's sort of God's favor upon you. So Moody is certainly not the most explicit of these sort of prosperity gospel preachers, but he's one of those early influences and would have especially influenced later people like the Reverend Billy Sunday in the 1920s. And then Billy Sunday was a huge influence on Billy Graham, who we will be talking about a little bit later in the episode. But I did just kind of want to mention that this was interesting because when Jeremy, when I was preparing for this episode, I kept thinking to myself, oh, this is great because this is exactly the kind of research I was talking about. So no doubt. Jeremy, I'll let you take it from here about the article that you found, which is like super interesting, of a sermon that you found that a preacher started doing in like the 1890s. He did it up to like into the 1920s.
Well, he started. It was Russell Conwell. I don't remember all the biographical information about him, but he was an American Baptist preacher, I believe. He took a trip to the Middle East. I think in the 1850s, 1860s. I don't know if it was a religious endeavor or something else, but he came back with a sermon that he's preached from like the 1860s through to the 1890s, wrote a book, and then it like continued. It was the market, that was the sermon of his career. And it was called Acre of Diamonds. And he basically spread through, I believe he said he took inspiration from poorer people in the Middle East being able to pull themselves up with faith, to bring prosperity to them in a terrible situation. So he came back and he started preaching to the South, the poorer regions of the South, this idea that if you put your faith in God, you give tithes and do your Christian duty to your church, that God will reward you with acres of diamonds. Now, Russell Conwell, I believe, did this a little bit more allegorical. I mean, it was still explicit, and it was still kind of a promise of earthly rewards based on divine favor. But he put a little bit more allegory in it than what you get with, your T.D. Jake, your Paula White. I would argue Joel Osteen's of today. So I don't want to completely throw this guy under the bus, but this is where it seems to have started in America, this kind of call of merging capitalist systems, free market systems with Christian ideals. I have a theory that it kind of goes to the Adam Smith's old "the invisible hand of the market decides the fate of the market," where Christians kind of just conflated an invisible hand with God, an invisible dude.
Oh, that's very interesting. So it's not necessarily Calvinism in the sense of predestination ideas, but it kind of harkens to that idea.
Right. And there's an invisible force to, if you work hard, it's almost like you follow a set of steps and then that unlocks God's reward. Now, yeah, it definitely doesn't fit into predestination, but it's almost like telling the story that if you are successful, you got God's favor. So I'd say it's a predestination in reverse. Like, that's the evidence of God's favor, which I would like to argue in this episode has directly led to the election of Donald Trump.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right that Donald Trump, the prosperity gospel, or broadly what other historians have called Christian libertarianism, created Trump. Like, Trump is a product of this. I think he's almost the ultimate product of this.
Oh yeah,
in some respects.
I think it's a targeted it's a targeted effort from the prosperity gospel preachers and organizations themselves to position Donald Trump as the basically the thing to mainstream this, because I grew up in the church, and I started, I kind of glanced at this, you know about the televangelists, about the give me 5 cents and you'll reap a reward later on. God will provide for you what you need. You don't know where you're going to get your sources of income, but as long as you have faith and give to the church, God will bring those sources of income to you. I mean, that always seemed antithetical to my church's belief systems, which were, they still kind of took those verses on a rich man. It's hard for a rich man to get into heaven as a camel to get through the eye of a needle. I mean, that was a big thing that I was learning. So,
or like Jesus going after the money changers. I mean, there's constant allusions in the Gospels about let go of your earthly riches and things like that.
Exactly, and so like if you look back, the past couple centuries, the Enlightenment brought upon Protestantism, right? The 92 Theses, or however many numbers they were, when Martin Luther King put those on the door.
Yeah, Martin Luther.
Yeah, so like it Protestantism was a response to Catholic kind of tyranny over the
absolutely.
Christian religion.
And it's an incredible amount of opulence. That you had the indulgences, you had the sort of the papal control of governments and economies. Yeah, I mean, Protestantism in many ways was certainly a response to what some people believed was sort of a teetering of political and economic power towards the very, very top.
Right. Right, and it was almost it kind of harkens to Donald Trump's populism, where you have to take the reins of knowledge and expertise from the leaders of the church and give it to the people and the pastors of each individual community or whatever. So it fits in that mold. I believe that was probably better for Christianity in the world overall, but I also think the Enlightenment was the engine of that, and it wasn't really, Martin Luther King didn't ignite that idea in people's head, that fire to kind of take back knowledge. That was Enlightenment scientists.
Oh no, you're absolutely right. I mean, that was the scientific revolution. That was Francis Bacon and Newton and Galileo, and then eventually you would have the Scottish moral philosophers, people like Adam Smith and David Hume, and then obviously the Englishman John Locke. There's one quote from this sermon that I just want to read because it blew my mind. So here it is from Acres of Diamonds. Quote, "Money is power, and you ought to be reasonably ambitious to have it. You ought because you can do more good with it than you could do without it. Money printed your Bible, money builds your churches, money sends your missionaries, and money pays for your preachers. And you would have not have many of them either if you did not pay them. I am always willing that my church should raise my salary, because the church that pays the largest salary always raises it the easiest. You never knew an exception to it in your life. The man who gets the largest salary can do the most good with the power that is furnished to him. Of course he can, if his spirit be right to use his for what it is given to him." So this quote that I read here, so if you take out like the God references, this reads like Atlas Shrugged. It reads like Ayn Rand.
No doubt.
It does not
That's
read,
right.
it reads like the money speech by Francisco d'Anconia in part 2 of Atlas Shrugged, where he this woman says money is the root of all evil, and he gives this like 30-page diatribe about how she's a dumb bitch and how basically what Ayn Rand says in that speech is money is the barometer of a society's virtue. And so like it's exactly this kind of idea. It's interesting to me how when I was reading this, I was like, this reads so much like Ayn Rand. It's weird.
Oh yeah, and it's, I mean, that perfectly maps to your Paul Ryan sense of republicanism.
Oh yeah, the whole thing about
deifies
like a free lunch will feed your stomach but will not feed your soul kind of thing.
Yeah. Exactly. Like you. But they talk about struggle and how you're personally responsible for your struggle, and act like you can just sit there and pray in a corner and throw some money in a church and that's it. and you'll get the money handed to you. So I mean, there's intelligent sides of all these theological debates or whatever. So some people say that's an oversimplification, but in practice, what is most of your congregation that's giving you that money believing? Is they're believing that they can just sit there and not do anything, pray, give money, and somehow will get magic sources of income. It's a secret. Or that Paulo Coelho book.
Paulo Coelho, The Alchemist.
Yeah, I like The Alchemist a lot, but that.
No, it's kind of that vein. You're right.
Yeah, exactly. And there is some merit to the idea of positive thinking allows you to see the opportunities that make your life better. Sure, that's true, but when you put the superstructure over it, it's used to basically squeeze as much money as poor people as possible. It's kind of like a Scientologist thing, except for they went after rich Hollywood people.
You're absolutely right. There was an amazing article that I read a few years ago. It was in the New Yorker. It was at the peak of when Rhonda Byrne and The Secret was really popular. It was like the height of that. And basically it talked about the origins of sort of the feel-good, self-help, prosperity gospel. There's another person I think we have to talk about is a guy named Wallace Wattles. He had a really, really funny name. But in the early 20th century, Wallace Wattles wrote this book called The Science of Getting Rich. And his whole book was this idea of essentially The Secret. It was the secret of its time, where it's like, if you believe in yourself, if you apply yourself, there's a scientific means by which you will receive good favor in this life. So even though it was called like The Science of Getting Rich, it was really sort of a pseudoscientific, new agey, religious kind of belief. And Wallace Wattles was also very influential on Norman Vincent Peale. And who, of course, would go on to become sort of a self-help guru with how to win friends and influence people.
Okay.
So there's this part of our country, the prosperity gospel sort of has like both a Christian element to it, as well as sort of a new agey, pseudoscientific woo-woo side to it as well. And they both kind of influence each other. And I think the logical conclusion to both of those styles is Joel Osteen.
Exactly. Although he is the most calm and put you to sleep deliverer of the message out of them all. I
think so. I read a book a few years ago about a guy who was like a journalist who went around the country asking people about what they thought about the end of the world, and like how the end of the world would come, and and things like this. Well, he talked about, there was an interview that Joel Osteen had done with Larry King, where Larry King asked him outright, like, do you believe in the apocalypse? Like, do you believe in the rapture and shit like that? And Joel Osteen was extremely reticent to answer the question. Like, he wasn't that jazzed about answering it. So he gave sort of these like vague platitudes about, goodness and evil and things like that. But he wouldn't give a clear theological answer, which is very indicative of his style.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, which was kind of covered in this piece that you sent to me by Chris Lehman of the Washington Post about how the prosperity gospel explains Donald Trump's popularity with Christian voters.
Is that the same article that mentions his Paula White conversion, his second coming, and they got evangelist?
Yeah, that one, and then the other one that was really good that was from Politico called Donald Trump's God Whisperer, which is all about Paula White as well.
Oh man, it's you guys all need to read about that. I mean, they have a lot of common. They have like 3 divorces, right? There's alleged affairs. They're just great examples of Christian people. I'm not judging people for having divorces or anything like that, but Christians do. So it seems odd to put all your faith into politicians like that who are backed by preachers of that style.
Oh, for sure. But this makes perfect sense with what we've talked about with this idea of the prosperity gospel and sort of how this ties into the Cold War period. Because if you think about the Cold War era, especially in the 1950s, in the 1950s is where you get laws for the first time that really explicitly meld God and country in a way that the country had not really done. One was the putting In God We Trust on money, and that was in, I think, 1954. and making that the national motto of the United States, which we had never really had one. We had an informal one, which was on our currency as well. It still is, which is E pluribus unum, out of many one, which has gone back to the founding. But the In God We Trust was one that was formalized by law. The next thing you had was under God being added to the Pledge of Allegiance. And then the third thing that you had, and the one that I think is the most interesting, and I think ties especially into talking about people like Joel Osteen and Paula White, is something called the parsonage allowance. And what the parsonage allowance was it was a special law written within the tax code in the 1950s when Eisenhower was president that allowed for Christians, not just Christians, but allowed for preachers, rabbis, any sort of religious leader that could claim that they were a part of a tax-exempt church, that they could be exempt from property taxes, and that they would be exempt from rental taxes. Let's say if you rent an apartment and you are a preacher, you could write off the taxes of renting a property that are built into your monthly rent. You could write those off in your taxes. And then the same with if you, let's say you owned your home, you could get out of paying for property taxes through the parsonage allowance, which Joel Osteen uses. So does Joyce Meyer. Paula White, I imagine, does too, where you can have a multi-million-dollar home and be worth $50 million.
Multiple multi-million-dollar properties.
And they don't pay property taxes on them. Because
I didn't even know that.
Because
that
of the parsonage allowance, and this is part of that whole thing where we were talking about how, Kevin Kruse, who's an historian at Harvard, wrote a book called "In God We Trust," all about this. And one thing he talks about is One Nation Under God is what the book's actually called. Sorry, how corporate America invented Christian America. And, Kruse argues this point of part of the reason we did a lot of this God stuff in the 50s was to fight back against the godless communists. But the other part of it was that the business leaders at the time, the people who ran, General Electric, the people who ran, General Motors, the people who ran Kohler, the faucet brand. There's a great story about the Kohler brand and their really blatant Christianity, and that led to labor struggles. It's in Rick Perlstein's book on Barry Goldwater. Fascinating stuff. But all these companies were all led by men who believed very deeply in sort of the prosperity gospel, that they believed in, a country that worshiped God, and that a country that blessed itself with God's praises was a country that would do well economically. So Kruse makes this point of it's about the communists, but it's mostly about money.
Okay.
Which is kind of, I think, an interesting thing. I mean, what's your take on that, Jeremy?
I would say that, the Russian... And it was a propaganda war on both sides for who was ideologically the most proper nation, the best moral leader. In Russia's case, it was more about saying that we weren't a moral leader. So I feel like, it has to do with the money, it has to do with the prosperity gospel, and it has to do with more ways to siphon money into the pockets of already rich people through congregations. But I wouldn't downplay the fact that the Cold War pigeonholed us into these kind of we are the Christian nation whose God's invisible hand makes our free market the most merciful of markets. If you are a loser in this system, that is your fault. But we have unchained the state from responsibility for your situation at all.
No, I think you're right about that for sure.
And then the Russian is a state-controlled media, and they control each of their population. Now, that's the ideological propaganda kind of playing field they're going with. And that leads in. When you play the moral high ground, it makes it harder for you to come up with rational decisions on the world stage, because it leads countries like Russia, like a couple of articles we'll post in the show notes, to do a whataboutism about it all. They'll mark, because we are the nation of God. So to us, we are perfect.
No, I think you're right. What were you going to say?
Oh, just as a perfect nation, of course, all our policies from Vietnam to any of the tactics we use in the Cold War to stockpiling a nuclear weapon is really just a God-given right. We're God's country.
It reminded me of, there was an interview that Vladimir Putin did a couple of years ago with PBS, where they asked him about like his crackdown on gay citizens and the LGBT community within Russia, and he said, "Well, you keep talking about how bad my human rights record is or whatever, but if you looked at the United States, look at Ferguson. Look at what's going on in Baltimore." He was basically talking about the police brutality and sort of saying,
completely legitimate, but it's Putin.
Yeah, right. Which is also the thing with the flip of it, when Donald Trump did the exact same thing when he was in an interview with Bill O'Reilly. And Bill O'Reilly said, Putin's a killer. And Donald Trump says, yeah, but we have killers too. You think we're so perfect? And it's like, when Ron Paul was saying things like that back in like 2008, when he was like a gadfly presidential candidate, he could kind of get away with that because like he wasn't going to be president. But when you're president, you are the leader of the free world to a lesser extent. And so even though what Donald Trump may have said was maybe like technically right in the sense that like, yeah, like our country has, we've killed dictators, we've installed dictators, we've knocked off democratically elected leaders, and in the Middle East and in Latin America, we've done it consistently. We do have in some respects, American empire. Like, you can't say that when you're president.
Right.
You just can't. And it's not because,
Bernie Sanders, commented on the overreaches of our military machine plenty of times, but Donald Trump only seems to bring it up when somebody's calling him out on his love of Russia. Or Putin only calls it out when somebody's discussing some failure of his administration. It's a debate tactic as opposed to a legitimate point.
Oh, absolutely. I think you're right, because I don't think Donald Trump really believes in anything but himself.
Oh, yeah. And getting money for his family.
So, Jeremy, I guess to kind of bring it back to kind of thinking about the prosperity gospel, why do you think that Donald Trump and people like Joel Osteen and people like Paula White, why do you think that these types have been so successful with both just the general public and in Trump's case with voters?
See, it has to be. At its core, I believe it has to do with the denial of science, because to not teach logical reasoning to people, to teach people not to trust statistics, data, experiments, you're kind of opening the door for everybody to be an expert and to be. You can even look into these sermons where these people talk about everybody. T.D. Jakes, I believe, called his followers little gods. Okay, so the idea that we all have within us the ability to be as morally righteous as God, I think, is what they're really getting at. And that through that moral righteousness, the world and God will give us riches. So when you combine that with self-help, the kind of the boomers, you can do anything type of thing, which I don't think was a bad thing, but it was easily taken to an extreme that kind of did deny the religious in general responsibility for their eternal soul. And it turned into this like easy step-by-step guide where, to get back on track, do this, and this. And an increasingly complicated, technologically driven world where you're losing your job every 2 seconds. It's better for society to make those people blame themselves for something as simple like a lack of faith. It's so ambiguous. There's no way to mark that. So there's a kind of chain of events that I think led people into this cult. And it by Donald Trump kind of taking the whole alt-right, combining it with the evangelical movement in some kind of weird, because the alt-rights, there's atheistic trends in the alt-right. They just happen to think that white Judeo-Christian Christianity, while they may not believe in God in their, I think Milo identified as a Catholic, but there was another major alt-righter who Richard Spencer, will quote Nietzsche and quote against the religious, but they're weird, they're strange bedfellows. But the religion think that the alt-right are the kind of the evil that they need to use to bring about the apocalypse. So that gets into the second big factor, which is they just yearn for the apocalypse. They think they're going to become active agents of it. So when you combine the fact that you have a bunch of poor people who don't know why can't get out of the situation they're in, which has a lot more to do with, city laws, corporate influences, redistricting, gerrymandering, like a whole host of things that they legitimately have little control over. And you pigeon that, you pivot that towards your own lack of responsibility. Come back to be faithful. The end of the world's coming anyway, so you'll get out of this situation. Take what you can from the system we've developed that will guarantee you riches. It's an attractive concept to a lot of people. It's basically fuck everybody else. And if I kind of get in my hole, pray to God, and do what I need to, I'll be rewarded. And if not, the world will end soon enough, so I'll be in heaven. Like, I'll be in the promised land. It's like this trifecta, this crazy philosophical trend that I just think has infected so many people in the church. And I'm not even saying all churches propose this at all. Like, I'm saying the Catholic Church has gone to a more Francis has gone to a more humanitarian reading of the Bible as popes from the past. He also hasn't solved the sex abuse from priests. But I do think it is a distortion from what I thought mainstream Christianity was when I was younger. I just believe they have let it get taken over by this because of their political fights.
No, I think you're right. I started reading a book today called The Death of Expertise, which is by Tom Nichols, which was based on a piece that he wrote for thefederalist.com probably a year or so ago. And he makes this point of, when you have a world in which there are no people who are experts, everyone becomes an expert. And it goes back to that quote, from Isaac Asimov, that we live in a place where my ignorance is just as important as your knowledge. And I think that's a huge problem. Now, to kind of close out this episode, one of the other factors that has sort of brought on this problem is not just prosperity gospel, but according to Peter Beinart, who wrote this piece for Newsweek, he makes the point of, this wasn't just the prosperity gospel. What brought all this crazy stuff on was secularism. He makes this argument in this piece he writes called America's Empty Church Problem. He wrote it for The Atlantic, not Newsweek, where he basically argues this point of, when people are no longer binded together by religion, when people leave religion, then sort of the unifying factors that pull people's political choices become way more primeval. And what he means by that is they just become more racist and nationalist and ethnically charged, rather than being about a struggle for religious morality. You're arguing sort of a political morality that sort of replaced it. And Beinart makes the argument of, well, if we just went back to a time where more and more people were religious, where more and more people were going to church and had a social system around them and weren't all by themselves all of the time, then maybe the alt-right wouldn't have been as successful. I think his argument is a little shitty. Maybe I'm biased because I'm an atheist, but I honestly think it's a little naive. I mean, what do you think about that, Jeremy?
Well, I get what he was going at, and I think it should be taken more as a call to the secular humanist section of atheism to really hit the whole local community aspect of their work.
I agree.
Because the reason why he is right is because the largest community organizations are churches and religious institutions. And that's a product of millions of followers over hundreds of centuries to millennia of building up wealth to throw into communities where, there's a church on every street corner in my town, but there's still homeless people on the streets. Explain that to me. So if more people were in the pews and they were with people of differing races, I get his point that they would be less nationalistic, less racist.
And that's my point.
I believe the only reason is because there's there's not a push into secular community centers, events, and things of that. And no matter what the Christians say, that we secularized everything that everybody does. A music concert can only do so much to bring people together.
No, I think you're right. And see, this is the thing that I had my problem with his argument, because I largely agree with it, because he's sort of making he's making the argument, it's sort of a Durkheimian sort of argument, where it's like religion is a social binder. And it ties people together. It unites people. It gives people a sense of community, and it gives people a sense of unification that they wouldn't get otherwise. I think that's a fair point. But that's not necessarily because of the explicit beliefs. It's about the institutions. And so what we're seeing right now is not so much a crisis that's because people are becoming less religious. I don't think that's the problem. What we're having right now is a crisis of institutions. Political institutions, economic institutions, social institutions, and it goes back to the whole problem of people, the anti-intellectualism, and this idea that people don't like experts, and they don't like leaders, and they don't like people telling them what to do. And when you have a society where the institutions are not properly sort of defended, despite their flaws, if they're not defended, then we get in a place where it's all up for grabs, which is why people like Richard Spencer and people like Steve Bannon, who we'll be talking about next week, that's how these people thrive, because there is not that sense of community. And so I do want to give credit where credit's due to people like Bart Campolo, and Greg Epstein at Harvard, and Phil Zuckerman, the secular humanist leaders who are trying to create humanist communities. And so I agree with you. I think we need more of that. But I think Beinert's whole argument is just, it needs to be focused more or less on sort of the social binding aspects rather than the specific beliefs. Because I don't think it is about beliefs. I think it's about social functions. Right.
Beliefs have 83% of Christian evangelicals thinking that Donald Trump's promises had anything to do with their stated faith in the last century. The prosperity gospel, it was a fringe religion up until what I am arguing it has become mainstream today. Largely, I mean, Trump is a signifier that it's mainstream. Like, you saw televangelists, their book sales are insane. They have mansions, they have yachts, they have boats and jets or whatever.
But they've always been kind of a fringe, they've always been sort of a fringe identity, and now they're not.
Right, except like Scientology, they got big rallies that you see a bunch of people there, but they're a fringe religion. The prosperity gospel has exploded, and Donald Trump being a man sent by God, whether or not you think he's a godly man, is an implicit acknowledgement that you're okay with that as a Christian in this country, that you are okay with the idea that money is an indicator of God's favor, that you are okay with like what I would think would be totally antithetical to any of the red text Jesus shit in the Bible. We just have a mass group of Christians who are being like, yeah, we're cool with it because we want the end of the world, and we think that a powerful military America taking on a holy war in the Middle East is going to bring about that, which will then get us to the rapture, which is ludicrous to me. The rapture is like some weird 1800s belief that Christians wouldn't experience the terrible times of tribulations when the Antichrist reigns on earth. That's some weak sauce, okay?
I agree.
Like, and the God of the Bible that I read is that you would shit yourself for 7 years through that, and if you kept your cool, then he might let you into his club. Like, that's the God of the Bible I got. No, not that you got raptured away when it was getting tough.
No,
like, what kind of bullshit is that?
I agree. And I mean, I think the thing that highlights all of these problems is the sheer fact that American evangelicals voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump shows you that there is a moral bankruptcy within Christianity in this country. Mm-hmm. That there is...
And it doesn't have to be that way.
Which,
I mean, I would love a world where there's no Christianity. But
it also shows you how wrong Christianity is, because Christianity for some people can be about justice and fairness and love and charity and simplicity and sort of
like
life.
The MLK Jr. Christianity, the good kind, the good for society kind,
the more secular kind, the more humanistic kind, the one that's more united by the sort of general lessons that one can glean from Christianity. And then there's the other side of it, which is the side that we're talking about tonight, which is a side that is so slavishly devoted to money, that is so slavishly devoted to a perversion of religion in a way that I think all different types of religions are perversions of religion, because religion is a perversion in general. But what I'm saying is that this type of perversion is one that is now perverting and corrupting our civic life.
Political life.
It's really,
and that's why they said keep that shit separate.
Which is all the more reason why we believe in a secular country.
Yeah.
Because
it protects your religious liberty.
Exactly.
As a Christian. It protects it from different sects imposing interpretations on you. It doesn't make any sense why you would want to go into the courtroom as a religious person and fight against gay marriage, as if that has anything to do with the running of your church.
Or fight against, but the thing you have to keep in mind too, and I did a huge rant like the week before the election on my former podcast, Army of Principles, where I said, these evangelical fuckers don't really care about God. They care about money. The reason they're backing Donald Trump is because Donald Trump said he'd get rid of the Johnson Amendment. And if he gets rid of the Johnson Amendment, that means that churches are going to be able to basically become dark money political organizations. They can do whatever they want with their money and can do whatever they want for candidates and keep their tax exempt status, which means that you and me as citizens are basically underwriting the cost of them getting to do whatever they want. But they wouldn't get to do that for me. And so I find that kind of shit, it just goes to show you how morally bankrupt these people are. That they don't really care. Like, they're using Christianity. They may genuinely believe it. I think most of them genuinely do.
Oh,
but
no doubt,
but they don't just genuinely believe it. They are using it as a tool to be profitable. Which,
look, if you look through history, Christianity has a terrible record. Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy has a terrible record. And they've just cobbled together 2,000 years later a decent version of this religion. And then they're letting these what they would call charlatans take it over, and they're just handing the reins over with an 83% approval rating. Like, it's crazy.
And yet we're only supposed to be worried about ISIS. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
Like,
because they're the ones coming. I see beheadings in my town all the time. That totally affects me, and I don't want to be, I don't want to be inhumane to the area, because I believe we need a smarter foreign policy there.
Yeah.
That addresses and lifts up secular voices there, or more moderate voices there, because the whole get rid of religion thing is a pipe dream in my lifetime.
Yeah.
But you can make it a non-apocalyptic, non-world. It holds our world in jeopardy the way that it's been twisted.
I agree.
And Steve Bannon is a perfect example of somebody who wants to use Christians to bring about a holy war that shapes the world into his European white image, what he thinks the nice Western, I don't know, maybe we'll all go back to Beethoven wigs or something. Like, I don't fucking know, but we'll get into that next week.
We will definitely get into that. Is a great tease for what we're going to be talking about next week. So you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at The Daily Clark. Please, you can send me an email at justin.clark@atheistallianceamerica.org. And, follow us on Facebook. We're really beefing up our social media presence. Check us out. Become a member at atheistallianceamerica.org. Jeremy, what do you want to plug?
You can email me at secularjak@gmail.com. I don't have a public Facebook page at the moment, but I'm looking into getting one. As we kind of update the website here soon, hopefully, and kind of increase our, we fix our podcast feed itself instead of just posting on YouTube and stuff.
Yeah.
I'll have some more. But for the moment, just email me at secularjak@gmail.com.
Absolutely. And if you want to listen to the fastest, easiest version of the episode, definitely check us out on YouTube. Just type in Atheist Alliance of America. All the episodes are up there, except for the first, I think the first 3 or 4 are not up there yet, but they will be in terms of the back catalog. And then we are revamping our feed, and so keep on track of that. Until next week, this is Justin Clark, and this has been Secular Nation.